On a Sunday evening in November, my grandson's other grandfather picked that boy up and threw him into the dining room wall so hard the plaster cracked. The sound of it stopped the whole room. But here is the part that was worse. Not one person at that table looked frightened. The boy's grandmother went right on cutting the chicken on her plate, as if nothing had happened at all. And his mother, my son's wife, looked at her own father and said, "Thank you, Dad," in front of everyone. And me? I stayed in my chair. I did not move. A lot of people will call me a coward for that, but if I had stood up that night, I do not believe my grandson would ever have been saved. It was the hardest decision of my 69 years, and if I could go back and do it again, I would do exactly the same thing. I folded my napkin. I stood up. I calmly excused myself to the bathroom, and then I made a phone call. Before I begin, tell me down in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. I read every single one of them. My name is Merrill Gundersen. I'm 69 years old and I live in Brewer, Maine, right across the river from Bangor, in a house my father built in 1961. I spent 29 years as an investigator for the Maine Attorney General's office, Consumer Protection Division. Now, people hear that and picture somebody handling complaints about a bad dishwasher, and some of it is that. What it mostly is fraud, contractor fraud, auto dealer fraud, predatory lending, charity scams that run through a church basement, and in my last 11 years, financial exploitation of older adults, which is the ugliest corner of the whole business. 29 years of sitting across a table from people who lie for a living. And here's the thing I learned in that job, and it is the whole spine of this story, so I need you to hold it. Nobody is dishonest in only one room. That's not a saying. That's a finding. 29 years of it. We'd open a file on a man for shaving 40 hours off an invoice on a septic system. Nothing. A misdemeanor. A fine. A headache. And every time you pulled that one thread, and it went everywhere. The taxes. The workers he was paying cash. The wife's name on a company she'd never heard of. The mother-in-law's house. Because the man who cheats on a $400 repair and the man who cheats on a $40,000 title are not two men. They're one man with two invoices. It comes from the same place, which is a settled, private belief that rules are a thing that happens to people who aren't clever enough to get around them. And here's the part that took me about 15 years to understand. It applies to how they treat people, too. I never once, not one time in 29 years, opened a file on a man who was crooked in business and gentle at home. Not once. I used to look for it. It doesn't exist. Hold on to that. It's coming back. To my son Denny, and to his wife Rhiannon, and most of all to her parents. I was a quiet old man from Brewer, who drove a 2009 Silverado and did his shopping on Tuesdays because that's when the store isn't crowded. I never corrected them. That was a choice and I'll get to it. My son is Denny. He's 37. He's a paramedic for the county, 9 years on the box, mostly nights out of the Bangor station. I want you to hold on to that too. His wife is Rhiannon. Everybody calls her Ronnie. She's 35. Their son is Fen. He was 8. And I had not laid eyes on my grandson in 7 months. Here's how that happened, and this is my part in it, and I'm putting it early because I'm not going to bury it at the end where it's easier. Last spring, Fen told me on the phone he wanted to learn to fish, so I spent about 3 weekends in my shop building him a tackle box. Pine, dovetailed corners, brass hardware off an old one of my father's, and I burned his name into the lid with a wood burner and sanded it, and put 4 coats on it. It came back. Refused. In Ronnie's handwriting on the label. And I sat in my truck in the post office parking lot with that box on the passenger seat, and I got angry. Properly angry. And then I did the thing I have not forgiven myself for. I decided that if that's how it was, that's how it was. And I put the box on a shelf in the shop, and I waited for somebody to come to me. 7 months. 29 years of investigating people, and a package came back refused, and I read it as an insult, to me. I didn't read it as information about a child. If you have ever pulled back from a family situation because you were tired of being the one who kept reaching and told yourself you were respecting their wishes, I need you to hear what took me a 1.5 years to hear. That is a completely reasonable thing for an adult to do about another adult. It is not a reasonable thing to do when there's an 8-year-old in the house. The text came the first week of November, from Ronnie. Sunday dinner at my parents'. 3. Fen's been asking about you. That was it. No warmth in it anywhere. Functional. Like a scheduling notice. And I got in the truck anyway. Because times Fenn's been asking about you times is a sentence that would have gotten me on a plane. They live out in Hampton. Her parents do Roland and Corva Thaxter, and the Sunday dinners were always at their place, which tells you the shape of that family right there. Roland Thaxter owns 3 power sports dealerships. Sleds, side-by-sides, boats, trailers. One in Hampton, one out toward Ellsworth, one down in Waldoboro. If you live in eastern Maine, you have seen the billboards. He's on them. Their place sits on about 9 acres with a paved circle drive and a pole barn behind it bigger than my house. I parked my truck behind Roland's diesel and Corva's Lexus, and I'll be honest with you, I sat there for a second and almost laughed. Because in 2004, I helped put a man in Warren for 11 months for running a title scheme out of a dealership about a third the size of Roland's. I didn't think anything of it at the time. It was just a thought that went through. Fenn came across that living room the second the door opened and hit me around the legs hard enough to move me back a step. He said, "Grandpa, you came." He smelled like the shampoo kids smell like. And I put my hand on the back of his head and I felt 2 things at once, and I want to describe both. The first was that he was thin, not sick thin. But my hand went on his shoulder and there was less shoulder there than there had been at Christmas the year before. The second was on his left forearm, just below the elbow. A bruise going yellow-green at the edges. 10 days old, maybe 2 weeks. And a kid that age is a bruise farm. I raised one. They come home in pieces from May to October. I know that. But it was November, and there was no snow yet. Roland came in from the kitchen with a bourbon in his hand at 3 in the afternoon. Big man, 63. Chest and shoulders, silver mustache, and that permanent flush that a man gets after about 25 years of afternoons. He said, "Well, look who found the place." And he looked at me the way a man looks at a trade-in he isn't going to give you much for. He asked what I used to do, and I said I worked for the state. He said, "Doing what?" I said, "Investigations, consumer complaints, mostly." And he repeated the word times complaints times back to me, and let it sit there a second. And then he laughed and said, "So people call you when they're unhappy about a toaster." And I said, "Something like that. I want to stop right here." Because in 29 years I sat across a table from probably 400 people who were about to be charged with something. And I learned early that the most useful thing in the world is a man who has decided you're stupid. They tell you everything. They cannot help it. They have to show you. So when Roland Thaxter decided I was a retired paper pusher who investigated toasters, I let him have it. I have let people have it my entire career. And that dinner was the worst 40 minutes I have spent at a table in my life. And the assault wasn't in it yet, because he spent the whole meal grinding down my son. Not shouting. That's what people expect. And it's not how it works. He did it with jokes. Denny works nights on an ambulance. 9 years. He has held pressure on a man's femoral artery on the airline road at 2 in the morning. He has done CPR on somebody's grandmother on a kitchen floor in Orrington. And Roland Thaxter said, across a table, "Public payroll. Can't beat it. Sit around. Wait for a call. Collect." And then to the table. I built something. 3 locations. 50. 1 employees. And every one of them eats because I get up in the morning. And then, to my son with a smile, "You ever think about doing something, Den?" Corva laughed. Ronnie looked at her plate and smiled at it. And my son stared at his food and said nothing. And I watched a 37-year-old man make himself smaller in a chair, and I understood something I had not understood before that afternoon. He had been getting that every Sunday for 11 years. If you have ever sat at a table and watched somebody you love get taken apart by inches, in front of everybody, with a smile on it and watch them take it, because taking it is cheaper than the alternative, then you already know what my hands were doing under that tablecloth. I said nothing, and I want to be honest about why, at that point in the evening, it wasn't strategy yet. It was that it wasn't my house, and it wasn't my marriage, and my son was a grown man, and I had been invited for the first time in 7 months, and I was afraid of losing it again. That's the actual reason. I was managing my access. And then Fenn kicked the table leg. That's all. That's the whole thing. An 8-year-old swinging his feet under a table caught the leg with his heel, and the glasses jumped, and about a half-inch of bourbon went over onto the cloth. And Roland Thaxter's face changed. I want to slow this down, because there is about 4 seconds between that and the wall, and I have gone through those 4 seconds more times than I have gone through anything in my life. He said, "Come here, Fen." "And my son and I want this on the record," my son said. "Dad." Just that. One word to his father-in-law, and it came out of him about half as loud as he meant it to. And Roland said, "I'm talking to him." And Denny stopped. And then Fen got out of his chair and walked around that table. And here's what got me. It wasn't crying. He wasn't crying. He walked around that table with his shoulders already up around his ears and his hands already in front of him and his chin already down. I have walked into a lot of rooms in 29 years. I know that walk. That's the walk a person does when they know exactly what's coming and exactly how long it lasts, and they're just trying to get through the first part. An 8-year-old should not have that walk. There is no way to learn that walk except by practicing it. And then it happened. And it took about 2 seconds, and I'm not going to draw it out for you because he's a real boy to me and I'm not going to perform it. He picked him up by the front of his shirt and put him into the wall. There was a sound from the wall, and a sound from the boy, and the second one was small and high, and it stopped partway through, which I found out later at the hospital is because he could not get air in. And Fen slid down onto the floor and sat there. Corva Thaxter did not stop cutting her chicken. I watched her. She did not miss a stroke. And Ronnie said, "Thank you, Daddy." Nobody moved. And Denny came about 4 inches up out of his chair, and then he sat back down and picked up his fork. Now, I have replayed that 1,000 times, and I want to say 2 things about it, and then I'll go on. The first is that I do not blame my son. I did that night. I don't now. It took me about 6 months to get there, and I got there when I understood that I had watched 11 years of that man happen to him in 40 minutes, and I had also said nothing. The second is the harder one, and it's about me. Every part of me was already out of the chair. My weight had already shifted. I want you to understand that I am 69, and I have a bad shoulder, and Roland Thaxter is 6 years younger and 40 pounds heavier, and it did not matter even slightly. I was going. And the thing that kept me in that chair was one calculation, and it took about 1.5 seconds. If I get up and put my hands on that man, here is what happens. There's a fight in front of a hurt 8-year-old. There's 2 men charged instead of 1, because I'd have been the one who threw first. Everybody in that room gives a statement that says the boy's grandfather assaulted somebody at dinner, and then it's a family disagreement. And a family disagreement gets settled by a family, and I go home, and Fen does not. And whatever happens to that child on Tuesday, when I am not there, is on me. That's it. That was the whole calculation, and I made it in about 1.5 seconds, and I have never been so certain of anything, and it has never cost me so much. So I folded my napkin and put it on the table and said I needed the bathroom. And Roland waved his glass at me and said, "Try not to fall in." I locked that bathroom door and sat down on the edge of the tub, and my hands were shaking so hard I dropped the phone once. And I called a woman named Maricela Ocaña. Maricela came to us at the AG's office in 2001, 24 years old, on a fraud desk, and I trained her for 2 years, and she was the best natural investigator I ever worked with. And then she left us for the state police because she wanted to work things where somebody got hurt. She's a detective sergeant now. Major crimes, up north. She picked up on the second ring and said, "Merrill?" Because I have not called that woman on a Sunday in about 9 years. And I said, "Mari, I need a unit at the Thaxter residence on the Kennebec Road in Hampton." And I heard her stand up. I gave it to her the way I would have given it to a duty officer in 1998, because that is the only way I know how to do it. I said, "Witness to an assault on a child, approximately 8 years old, occurred within the last 4 minutes. Perpetrator adult male, 63, roughly 240, has been drinking since at least 3. Child was lifted and thrown against a wall hard enough to crack the drywall and has not gotten up. He needs to be seen." The child's mother and grandmother verbally approved. "I'm in the house. I'm not in any danger." And she said, "Merrill, are you times and times there right now?" And I said, "I'm in the bathroom," she said, rolling. And then I said one more thing, and this is the part that mattered more than I knew at the time. I said, "Mari, the man is Roland Thaxter, Thaxter Power Sports." And there was about a second of silence. And she said, "The billboards." And I said, "The billboards. This is going to get loud, so make the courtesy call to whoever needs it before somebody else does." She said, "Already thinking about it." I ran the water and I looked in that mirror at a tired old man in a good shirt and I said, out loud, in somebody else's bathroom, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry it took 7 months." Then I opened the camera on my phone, started it recording, and walked back out to that table holding it down at my hip. And here's the part that I would not wish on anybody. I had to sit back down. 18 minutes. Fen was back in his chair. Somebody had put him back in it. And he was eating green beans. One at a time, off the fork, mechanically, looking at the plate. That's the detail. If you've ever been a kid in a house like that, you know exactly what that is. Finishing your plate is the price of being left alone. So you eat, and you get small, and you wait for it to be over. And Roland Thaxter had already gone right back into it. He was on hockey now. He was telling my son that hockey's for rich kids from away, and that football makes a boy tough, and that Fen wasn't going to get anywhere being coddled. And then he said, "No offense." I kept my face completely still, and I kept that phone at my hip, and I filmed 18 minutes of a man talking about toughness across a table from a child he had just put into a wall. I have watched that video twice, once with Mari, and once at trial. I will not watch it again. 18 minutes, 2 seconds off. The doorbell went at 5:19. Now I want to slow all the way down, because this next stretch is about 12 minutes long, and it is the reason I'm telling you any of this. Corva went to the door, and I heard her voice go up in that bright hostess register and then stop dead partway through a word. 2 state troopers, a Hampton officer, 2 paramedics with a bag, and behind them Maricela Ocaña in a jacket with her hair pulled back, 50 now, gray coming in at the front. Roland got half out of his chair. He said, "What in the hell is this? This is private property." And Mari did not answer him. She went down on one knee next to my grandson's chair. She looked at that boy at his level and she said, "Hi, I'm Mari. I'm a police officer. This is Kevin, and he's going to take a look at you. Is that all right?" And Fen looked at his mother. That's the part. 8 years old, and the first thing he did was check with the room. And times then times, she stood up and turned around and looked at Roland Thaxter. She said, "We're responding to a report from a witness inside this residence of an assault on a child. I need everyone to stay where they are." And Roland said, "A witness? In my house? What witness?" And Mari looked at me. She said, "Sir, can you confirm what you reported?" And I set my napkin down. And I said, "My name is Merrill Gundersen. I'm Fen's paternal grandfather. Approximately 22 minutes ago, at this table, I watched Mr. Thaxter take that child by the front of his shirt, lift him off the floor, and throw him into that wall. And I pointed at the crack in the drywall, which was about 11 inches long, and which nobody had said one word about for 22 minutes. And I said, the boy could not draw a breath for about half a minute afterward. Mrs. Thaxter, who was seated there, made an approving comment. My daughter-in-law thanked her father. And then I said, I have video. Roland's face went from red to something gray and waxy, that I have seen maybe 6 times in my life, and always in the same circumstances. He said, "You called the Times police, in my house, on a Sunday." And then he said the sentence he should not have said. He said, "And who the hell are you that anybody's taking your word over mine?" And it got very quiet. And Maricela Ocaña turned to face him and said, "And I am giving you this close to exactly, because I have thought about it a great deal." She said, "This man is Merrill Gundersen. He was a senior investigator with the Attorney General's office for 29 years. He testified in over 200 cases in this state, including some against people in your industry. And he trained me when I was 24 years old." And then she said, "When he tells me what he saw, I'm done needing to hear anybody else's version." And nobody in that room said one single word. I want to tell you what I felt, because it is not what you'd think, and I've been honest with you the whole way. I did not feel vindicated. I felt sick, because a police officer had just had to state my resume out loud in a dining room in order for an 8-year-old to be believed. Fen had a crack in a wall behind him and a mark on his arm, and he could not get air for 30 seconds, and none of that was enough by itself. What tipped it was that his grandfather happened to have a job that impressed somebody. And I thought about every child in this state who does not have one of those at the table. That thought has not left me since. Ronnie was looking at me, and her face, I've never seen anything like it. She was looking at me like a stranger had been sitting in her parents' dining room for 2 hours. And the paramedic straightened up from Fen and said, quietly, to Mari, "I've got tenderness up high in the neck and his pupils aren't equal. I want him in." And Ronnie said, "He's fine. Don't touch him." And the paramedic said, "Ma'am, that's not entirely up to you right now." And then my son stood up. Denny put both hands flat on that table like a man steadying himself on a boat. And here's the thing that I did not put together until about 4 hours later at the hospital, and when I did it took my legs out from under me. My son is a paramedic. He knew exactly what times pupils aren't equal times means. He has said that sentence himself, into a radio, at 2 in the morning, about somebody else's child. He heard it about his own son, in his mother-in-law's dining room, 22 minutes late. He said, "Take him, take my boy, I'm riding." And when they carried Fen past me wrapped in one of those silver blankets, that child reached out and got 2 fingers on my sleeve and said, "Grandpa, are you coming?" And I said, "I'm right behind you, bud." Roland Thaxter was arrested at his own dining room table at 5:41 inches the afternoon with his napkin still tucked into his collar. Corva wasn't taken that night. She got a very quiet conversation on her own front steps about what mandatory reporting is and a promise that somebody from the state would be calling her within 48 hours, and they were. At the hospital in Bangor, they found a hairline fracture high in his neck, at the second vertebra, plus a concussion. The doctor was maybe 40, and she was very careful with her words, and she said something to us that I have not been able to put down. She said, "I want to be clear about the range here. With this mechanism, this location, a small amount more force, and we are having an entirely different conversation." And she let that sit there. And my son put his head in his hands in that corridor, and made a sound I have never heard a grown man make, and I hope never to hear again. And then he looked up at me with his eyes running, and he said, "Dad, who times are times you?" And I said, "I'm your father. That's what I am. The rest of it was a job I used to have." And he said, 29 years, and you never once." And I said, "No." And I told him why, and I'll tell you, because it's the truth even though it looks worse now than it did then. I did not want my son introducing me at things. I did not want to be Denny's father, the investigator. I had watched other men's kids do that, and I had watched what it did to them. I wanted to be the boring guy in the truck who shows up with a cooler. And he said, "You could have stopped him. Years ago. The first time he started in on me at a dinner. You could have said one sentence." And I said, "Yes." And then I said the truest thing I know about my whole career, and it did not make either of us feel any better. I said, "Denny, people show you precisely who they are the moment they decide you don't matter. That's the only time you get a clean look. I've spent my life letting men talk in front of me because they thought I was nobody." And he said, "So what were you waiting for?" And I didn't have an answer. I still don't. 7 months. A box on a shelf in my shop with his name burned into the lid. The next morning I made 2 calls. The first was to a family attorney in Bangor named Nadine Farrow, who is about 5'1", and who I have watched take a courtroom apart, and who said, "Get me everything by Thursday." The second was to a man named Ozzie Lecomte, who spent 22 years in IRS criminal investigation, and retired to Winterport, and does forensic work now when he's bored. And I said, "Ozzie, Thaxter Power Sports, 3 locations. I want to know if the books are clean." There was a long pause on that line, and Ozzie said, "Merrill, are we doing what I think we're doing?" And I said, "I'm an old man asking a friend a professional question about a business." And he laughed and said, "You have not lost one step. Give me 2 weeks. And I want to be very clear about what I did and did not do, because this is the line and I have thought about it a lot. I did not fabricate anything. I did not access anything. I did not have anybody do me a favor that wasn't a favor any citizen could ask for. What I did was point a competent person at a business and say, 'Times, look,' because 29 years told me one thing with total confidence. Nobody is dishonest in only one room. A man who throws a child into a wall on a Sunday and then sits down and finishes his dinner is not running a clean business on Monday. He can't be. It's the same muscle. It's the same private belief that the rules are a thing that happens to people who can't get around them." Ozzie came back in 11 days. Thaxter Power Sports had been buying flood and salvage units out of state, mostly sleds and side-by-sides, running the paperwork through a limited liability company registered in another state, and selling them as clean. 6 years of it, minimum. Hours rolled back on machines. Roughly $1.6 million in income that never appeared anywhere. Structured cash deposits at 3 different branches. And the registered agent on the shell company was Corva Thaxter. Not an accessory. A principal. I sat on my back steps that evening with my old lab sailor's head on my knee, listening to Fen watch cartoons in my living room in a soft neck collar, and Denny out in the driveway on the phone with Nadine about emergency custody. And I want to be honest about what that felt like, because people expect one thing and it was another. There was no triumph in it. It felt exactly like finding the leak. That's the closest I can get. When you've been hearing a drip somewhere in a wall for 2 months and you finally open it up and there it is, you don't celebrate. You just stop hearing the drip. The rest went fast once it started, and it went the way it goes when a system that people complain about actually works. 6 weeks after that Sunday, a registered letter arrived at the Hampton dealership from IRS Criminal Investigation. 4 days after that, the state suspended all 3 dealer licenses. 2 days after times that, his floor plan financing got pulled. That's the credit line that pays for the inventory on his lots because a suspended license breaches the covenant. All 3 locations, inside a week, from a man out on bail to a man who could not legally sell a used trailer. He called my son screaming that I had done this to him. And Denny, who I am prouder of for this than for anything, Denny said, "Roland, I don't think you did anything wrong," and hung up. Ronnie filed for divorce in January, expecting it to be quick. She got Nadine Farrow instead, who filed a counter-petition the same afternoon with 31 exhibits: the medical records, the police report, the state's preliminary findings, my video, and 4 sworn statements from neighbors on the Kennebec Road about 11 years of noise. Denny had emergency custody by the middle of January and full custody by March, with supervised visitation for Ronnie, contingent on completing a family violence program. The trial was in April. I sat in the second row every single day in a suit I bought for it. Corva took a separate plea in exchange for testifying, and she got up there and said she'd been afraid of her husband her whole life, which I think is about 40% true, and which the jury did not appear to buy at all, since she had been on video not missing a stroke with her knife. The video did the work. It always does. The jury was out 2 hours and 20 minutes. Guilty on all of it. And at sentencing, the judge said something I wrote down in the car afterward, so I'd have it right. She said that a 63-year-old man who assaults a child of that size and then remains at the table and continues his meal has told the court something about himself that no character letter is going to undo. 6 years. 4 to serve. He never looked at me. Not once, in 9 days of trial. Not when the verdict came in. Now here's the part I have to do, and I don't want to, and I'm going to anyway. Roland Thaxter's father ran a garage in Hampton until 1988, and there was testimony at that trial from his own sister, who came up from Portland to give it, which took something that his father corrected him the same way, in the same town, on the same land, for about 20 years. And I sat in that second row and listened to a 63-year-old man's sister describe him at 9 years old. And the thing that got me was what Roland said to a probation officer during the presentence work, which ended up read into the record. He said the world was going to hit that boy eventually, and it was better it came early, from family, from somebody who loved him, so he'd learn it while the stakes were small. He believes that. That's the thing. That is not a man reaching for an excuse. That is a 60-year-old philosophy that he has, and that he can defend, and that he thinks makes him the only adult at the table willing to do the hard thing. And then he said one more thing to that officer, and it's the sentence I can't get out of my head. He said he still can't sit at a table with his back to a door. 63 years old. He took the worst thing that ever happened to him, and rather than face that it damaged him, he decided it was a gift, because a gift you can pass on, and damage you have to sit with. That is not an excuse, and I want to be extremely clear that I do not forgive it. He put my grandson in a wall. There is a version of that Sunday where Fen does not walk again, and that version was about 2 inches away. But I understand exactly how a man gets there. And I think we all want these people to be monsters because monsters are rare, and this isn't rare, and that's much worse. Ronnie came to my door in June. Thinner. Different. She stood on my steps and asked if she could say something, and I let her. She said she grew up afraid of that man. She said the whole architecture of her childhood was figuring out how to be on his side fast enough. Agree first, agree loud, never be the one he's looking at. And she said that when he started in on Denny at those dinners, some part of her was relieved, and she has to live with that. And then she said the thing about the thank you. She said, I didn't decide to say it, it came out of me. I've been saying it since I was 8. And I believe her. I actually do. And I told her that believing her and forgiving her are not the same thing, and that she wasn't entitled to either from me, and she was certainly not entitled to that boy. I told her if she wants a relationship with Fen, she is going to earn it exactly the way the court laid it out. Step by step, supervised, year by year. And it might not work, and that will not be unfair. She's about a year and a half into the program now. She hasn't missed one. I want that said, because it's true. At the bottom of my steps, she turned around and asked me if I was the reason the IRS came. And I told her the truth, which is that her father ran a fraud for 6 years, and the federal government eventually noticed, which is what it does. I have never told her about the phone call to Ozzie Lecomte, and I'm not going to, and I'm telling you instead. Because I don't think what I did was revenge, and I want to explain the difference the way I understand it after 29 years. Revenge is when you do something times to times somebody. What I did was make sure people were looking. That's all. Roland Thaxter built the whole thing himself. He ran it for 6 years. Every document that convicted him was one he signed. I didn't hand anybody a weapon. I just turned on a light in a room he'd been counting on staying dark. So here's what this whole thing taught me. And it is not what I expected at 69 years old. Everybody wants the lesson to be times, don't underestimate quiet people. And that's a nice line, and it's on the thumbnail of about 4,000 videos, and it has never once protected a child. The real one is the one I built a career on and did not apply at my own family's table. Nobody is dishonest in only one room. If somebody in your life is cutting corners in one place, they are cutting corners in all of them. If a man lies to strangers about money, he is not being scrupulously fair to the people who can't leave. It is one person. It is one belief. It shows up everywhere, and the reason it seems to only show up in one place is that you are only looking in one place. And the corollary, which is the one that cost me 7 months. When somebody removes you from a child's life, that is information about the child, not about you. I got a package back marked refused, and I heard an insult. I should have heard an alarm. Those are the same envelope, and I have spent 29 years teaching people to tell the difference, and I could not do it about my own grandson because my pride got in the way for 210 days. So here's the one thing I'd ask you to actually do, and it takes 11 seconds, and I mean this more than anything else I've said. If you ever see a mark on a child and you tell yourself a story about it times he's a boy, he plays rough, he's always got something, times write it down. The date, and one sentence about what you saw. In your phone. Nobody sees it. You're not accusing anybody of anything. Because you will not remember. I promise you that. Every single one of those is times probably nothing times on the day, and the entire way these things come to light is that somebody can say, when, and the second thing, and it's shorter. You do not need proof to make a report. You are not required to be sure. Every state in this country has a child protection line. Most of them take anonymous calls. And determining whether it's anything is literally somebody's job. It is just not yours. You are allowed to be wrong. I would rather you be wrong 11 times. And the question I sit with, most nights, still, what have I decided is none of my business, and who exactly benefits from me deciding that? Because for 7 months I decided Fenn's house was none of my business. And I'll tell you who benefited from that. It wasn't him. Fenn is to now. He lives with his father, and he's at my place most weekends, for the yard and for sailor and for the shop, where I'm teaching him to run a scroll saw with a great deal of supervision and a certain amount of yelling. He sleeps through the night now. That took about 14 months and a very good counselor at a children's center in Bangor, and I would give that woman a kidney. We went up to Nicotis the summer after, and he caught a brook trout off the dock 11 inches, which he tells people was 13, and that photograph is on my mantle and it will be there when I'm dead. He got the tackle box. I gave it to him the week he came home from the hospital. He asked me why it had his name on it if I'd never given it to him. And I said I made it a long time ago, and it took me a while to get it to him. And he said okay, because he was 8, and he has never asked again. And someday, when he's about 25, I am going to tell him the whole truth about those 7 months, because he'll have earned it, and I'll owe it. Now I want to hear from you, because people come down hard on this in both directions, and I have gone back and forth for 2 years. Comment 1 if you think I did right staying in that chair, making the call, and filming 18 minutes instead of putting my hands on that man. Comment 2 if you think I should have gotten up the second it happened. Consequences be damned, because there are things a grandfather does not sit through no matter how it plays out in court. And comment 3 if you think none of it makes up for the 7 months. and that the real failure in this story happened in a post office parking lot in the spring with a box on the passenger seat. Number 3 is mine. That's the one I actually think is true, and I'd like to hear if you disagree with me, because nobody in my family will say it to my face. And tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are right now. It's about 9:15 here, and it's blowing pretty good off the river, and it still gets me that somebody's hearing an old state investigator talk while they're eating breakfast on the other side of the world. And here's the one I really want. If you ever saw something with a kid, a mark, a flinch, a walk across a room, and you told yourself a story about it and moved on, tell me. You don't have to say who. Just tell me what the story was that you told yourself. Because mine was times That's How Boys Are in November, and I told it to myself with my hand on his shoulder, and I am going to be carrying that one for a while. If this reached you, stay with me and subscribe. It's an old man in Brewer with a microphone, a bad shoulder, and a dog who snores. There's another one coming. Take care of the small ones. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Bangor to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.